All right, so welcome back. So this is going to be part 5 of our integumentary system lecture, and in this one we're going to talk about the hypodermis, sometimes called the subcutaneous layer, and we're also going to be looking at some accessory structures of the skin as well. All right. So when we look at the word hypodermis, hypo means below or beneath, and dermis is referring to the dermal layer of the skin that we talked about previously. So by definition, hypodermis is talking about the layer beneath the dermis, and we'll see that it's sometimes also referred to as the subcutaneous layer as well. So here's what we're talking about. So we're talking about this layer that you see bracketed way down here. So this is our hypodermal or the hypodermis layer of the skin, all right? And so this is called subcutaneous because sub means below, just like hypo, and cutaneous is referring to the skin. All right, so this is meaning the layer that is below or beneath the skin. And that's actually a very good way to describe it because it turns out that it's actually not a layer of the skin. Okay, so this hypodermal layer is not an actual layer of the skin, so it's considered subcutaneous, beneath the skin, or hypodermis, below the dermis. All right, so the main thing that makes up the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer is fat. All right. So adipose tissue. So from our histology lecture, you should recall that fat is a type of loose connective tissue um, made up of adipocytes, but we also have blood vessels. We have collagen fibers down here as well. All right. So you may have heard of subcutaneous um, medications or subcutaneous uh, needles, giving subcutaneous injections. This is giving the medication into this subcutaneous layer. So a good example of this is something called insulin, right? We've likely all heard of insulin. Insulin is a hormone produced by your pancreas that helps regulate blood sugar, and you administer this in a clinical setting. You administer it into the hypodermis tissue or the subcutaneous tissue. So you're giving it into the fat, but specifically because there are blood vessels down here in this layer, and so you're giving into this area. The medication is absorbed, it goes into the bloodstream, and then it can circulate throughout um, and exert its effect on various tissues to help regulate blood sugar. Right. It can also help with insulation and cushioning, right? So fat can have a insulative and protective function that we talked about when we did our histology lecture. And it can also serve as an energy reserve, right? And now this is a layer that's going to vary from person to person, right? So some individuals are going to have more or less subcutaneous fat than others, okay? So when I did my I may have mentioned this story in a previous lecture, but when I did my gross anatomy um, uh, cad- uh, cadaveric dissection, one of our cadavers, it was a female, and she had a very significant amount of subcutaneous fat, and so it took a lot of effort to cut through her skin. Whereas another one of our cadavers, also female, elderly, she had basically no subcutaneous fat. It was her skin was paper thin, and so when you cut through the skin, you have to be very careful so as not to damage underlying muscle, nerves, blood vessels, tendons, things like that. Okay. All right, so the subcutaneous layer is pretty straightforward. Um, and so we're going to now look at some of the accessory structures. So we're going to look at hair, we'll look at nails, we'll look at something called the erector pili muscle and some other things like that. All right. So when we look at hair, hair is a very obvious accessory structure. We see it distributed all throughout the body and concentrated in various areas, right? And and so um, our hair can have it can serve a number of different functions depending on where that hair is located. Okay, and so one area that it's located in is the head. Right, we also have it um, throughout the body on our limbs. So on the head and things like this, the hair can help with protection from UV radiation. Um, when you think of hair in the nose or something like that, you can think of it as helping to protect and filter out the air that we're breathing in. Hair also serves a sensory function. So um, there's a plexus of nerves that surrounds our hair root, which is called the hair root plexus. And so this is very easily tested yourself if you look at your hand or you look at your arm or something and you run your finger over the hair without touching your skin. Just by moving the hair, you can sense that and you can perceive that, right? You can tell that you're moving the hair, and it's because distortion of the hair shaft, which is the part of the hair above the skin, moves the hair root, which distorts and pulls and tugs on those nerves of the hair root plexus that then sends a signal to our brain, and we're able to perceive that. Okay, and the hair can also serve as a form of identification, and also hair between different species as well. So you can tell if a hair is a dog hair or cat hair or a human hair or things like that. Okay, so we'll look at the general structure of hair and see how it arises um, from beneath the skin, and then we'll also see some kind of gross anatomical features of hair. All right, so if we look at hair here, we see that the hair consists of various parts. Okay, so the part of the hair that's most obvious to us is the hair shaft. Right, that's the part that sticks above the skin. So we can see our hair shaft here. We also see the hair root, just like the roots of a plant or roots of a tree are beneath the surface. The root of the hair is that which is beneath the surface. So whenever you pull out a hair, you're pulling out, at least in part, you're pulling out part of the hair root as well. And then you have something called the hair bulb. So the hair bulb is this large base or this large swelling, and we'll look at a better picture in the next slide, that sits at the very bottom of the hair root. And in this hair bulb, this is really kind of where we have the origin of new hair growth. So the cells that are contributing to hair growth are located down here. Okay, so here's a nice section um, of a hair follicle, and specifically looking down at the bulb. All right. So there's a region here called the hair root matrix, or this hair matrix. All right. This is where you have actively dividing cells that are undergoing mitosis. They have a blood supply. They're being nourished, and they're multiplying and dividing and pushing their way up into this medulla and then kind of out into these various layers. And this is what contributes to new hair growth. All right. Now we also see this hair papilla. This is what contains the blood vessels and nerves and whatnot that supply this hair matrix that is then giving rise to the new hair as it pushes up. So you can see a histological image of this same thing right here. So here's your hair papilla, this little kind of raised, rounded region here. And then sitting just superficial to that, just on top of that, you have your hair matrix with the actively dividing cells pushing their way up to contribute to new hair growth. All right. So if we were to take a cross section of a hair, we would see a couple of different things. All right. We would see various layers to the hair, from superficial to deep, or you can think from deep to superficial. All right. So if you look at the most deep part of the hair, okay, the deepest part, this is called the medulla. All right. So the medulla of anything is something that is internal. It is the deepest, most central part of that structure, right? So you have a medulla to the kidney, and you have a medulla to the adrenal gland, right? And so we also have a medulla to the hair. This middle portion here. If you look up at the top right here, these dark things that you see in the middle here, so you can see this dark band here, this one that's kind of fragmented, and then you don't see one here. These are patterns to our hair medulla, right? So if you move just superficial to the hair medulla, you get to the hair cortex, right? And I should note that in the medulla, we have very soft keratin. So this is the softest part of the hair, all right? As we move out to the cortex of something is that which is more superficial. So we have a cortex of the kidney called the renal cortex. We also have an adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland, all right? So same principle here. We're moving more superficial. And here we have keratin as well, but it is harder. Okay, so we have more hard keratin. It is not as soft. It is more dense and firm. Okay. And this is formed by cells near the edge of the hair matrix. All right. So whenever we looked here at this, here's our hair matrix. Toward the sides here, as these cells push their way up, you can see that they're contributing to the formation of the cortex itself. All right. And then lastly, this outer region here, this is what's called the cuticle of the hair. So the cuticle of the hair is, when you look at a hair, that's the part that you actually see from a superficial aspect. And it's made of very hard keratin because it's the most superficial part of it, right? So it makes up the outer layer of our hair shaft, the outer layer of what we can actually see for our hair, right? Now, we know that hair can have various characteristics. So we'll talk about color. We'll talk about classification of hairs in the next slide, about how you can classify it based on location and some other characteristics. And then we'll look at how you can actually grow the hair out, right? So in terms of the color, um, our hair comes in a number of different colors, as we've noticed from just a simple glance of people around us, right? You can have blonde hair, and you can have red hair, and you can have black and brown and various different shades, right? And so the pigment that gives rise to the color of the hair is the same pigment that we have that gives rise to the color of our skin, right? So this is the melanin pigment that's synthesized by melanocytes, right? And so the different types of color hair that we see in individuals is a result of the amount and type of melanin, right? So eumelanin, we talked about this um, previously, but the prefix "u" means true. All right, so eumelanin means true melanin, and this is the kind of typical melanin that we think of. This is the brown or kind of darkly pigmented black pigment that we see that gives rise to darker skin color as well as darker hair color as well, right? And then we have another type which is called pheomelanin, and pheomelanin is different than eumelanin. It's what is most commonly found in individuals with more fair skin, they're lighter complected, and those that have red color hair to them as well. All right. So now, if we look at the classification of hair, so that was the color. We can also classify hair based on its consistency, if you will, and its location. Right. And this comes in two types. We have vellus hairs and we have terminal hairs. Okay. So vellus hairs, these are very fine. They're very small, and they're located kind of scattered throughout the body. All right. So you can see some of these on your hands. You can see them on various parts of your extremities as well. Okay. Then you get into terminal hairs, and the terminal hairs, terminal meaning kind of the final or the end part of something. Um, these are the ones that are more coarse, so they're not as fine. They're a little bit more rough in consistency. They're typically longer, and these are ones that can develop during puberty, right? So hair that we have arise around our genital areas, pubic areas, for men associated with facial hair and chest hair. These are a type of terminal hair. They're more coarse than the fine vellus hairs, which you can kind of think of as almost like peach fuzz. You've heard that term, peach fuzz. Very, very fine, typically blonde, very lightly pigmented, whereas the terminal hairs are typically more darkly pigmented. They're more coarse, and they're usually concentrated in certain areas. All right. All right. And then lastly, here we can look at our growth of our hair. All right. And there's three general phases to the growth of the hair, and these are called the anagen, catagen, and telogen phases. All right. So if we start with the anagen, so the anagen phase, you can think anagen. This is the active phase. This is when hair is actively dividing. The hair uh, papilla, with its blood vessels, is supplying the hair matrix that is contributing to those new cells that are pushing their way up into the hair medulla and the hair cortex and giving rise to new hair growth. We also have the catagen phase. Catagen phase is the second phase where we're transitioning from actively supplying the hair with a blood supply and nutrients contributing to growth to where it then detaches from that blood supply. It's not necessarily um, dying. It's not necessarily actively falling out, but it's no longer receiving a blood supply, so it's no longer actively growing and dividing. Okay, and then lastly, we get to the telogen phase, in which we have a complete detachment from the blood supply. Because we have no blood supply, we have no nourishment, so the hair matrix begins to slow down its activity. It will eventually begin to kind of work its way out of the hair follicle, and then it will ultimately fall out, right? And then we have a new hair growth cycle start over, and this process can continue and continue. All right. Now, one last thing I want to say about hair is this structure called the erector pili muscle, right? And we've all heard of the term goosebumps, right? Sometimes it's called goose flesh. The technical term is piloerection. And what the goosebumps or this piloerection or this goose flesh is a result of is a little small smooth muscle called the erector pili muscle, right? So from our histology lecture, we looked at different classifications of tissues, and one of those tissues being muscle tissue, and one of the types of muscle tissue we looked at was smooth muscle, right? And this is what we see here in this histology image, and then what we see over on the left diagram, right? This is a band of smooth muscle called the erector pili muscle. During sympathetic stimulation, and we'll talk about sympathetic stimulation later in the semester, During sympathetic stimulation, this smooth muscle contracts, right? So this is an involuntarily stimulated muscle, so we don't control it. And when it contracts, it pulls on this hair follicle, right? So here's the follicle on the left, here's the follicle on the right. As it pulls on the follicle, it raises it up and it causes the hair to stick up and kind of stick out a little bit further in the skin, hence the term goosebumps, right? You get these little bumps that you see on your skin. It's also called piloerection, so just meaning the stiffening and the contraction of this erector pili muscle. Okay, so the goosebumps don't really serve any function in us any longer. Perhaps perhaps they used to, but there's really no significant purpose for the erector pili muscle and for the development of goosebumps any longer. Okay. All right. So we're going to stop here and we're going to pick up talking about another accessory structure, the nails, in our next part.